welcome back to the deep dive.
Back again.
This time, we're getting pretty personal.
Oh, yeah.
We're exploring self-esteem.
Self-esteem.
And I think, everyone listening has probably dealt with this at some point. You shared some excerpts from a philosophical dialogue.
Yeah.
And it seems like we're going to try to figure out why we sometimes just don't like ourselves.
Yeah. These excerpts, they offer like a really unique take on this whole thing.
Oh.
They suggest that disliking ourselves might actually serve a purpose, almost like a psychological strategy.
Okay, you've already got my attention. You know I love a good psychological deep dive.
I figured you would.
So these excerpts,
Right.
they feature a conversation between a youth and a philosopher. And the youth is really struggling with self-esteem,
Yeah.
kind of fixated on their flaws. It's almost like listening in on a therapy session.
It is a bit like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is how the philosopher responds. Instead of like offering the typical advice, they actually suggest that this self-dislike might be a choice that the youth is making, and one that serves a function.
Wait, hold on. How can not liking yourself be a good thing? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does on the surface, right?
Yeah.
But the philosopher uses this analogy of a student who was terrified of blushing.
Blushing.
And she believed that her blushing was preventing her from telling someone she liked how she felt.
Okay, I can see where this might be going. I used to hate speaking up in class.
Yeah.
Because I thought everyone would notice how much I was sweating.
Exactly. And the philosopher, they saw the blushing not as the problem itself, but as like a symptom, a defense mechanism.
Okay.
It was a way for the student to avoid potential rejection.
Okay.
If she got rejected, it wouldn't be because she wasn't good enough, but because of the blushing.
So it's like subconsciously creating an excuse.
Wow.
Like, I'm not failing, it's this thing that's holding me back. Okay.
It protects the ego. And the philosopher suggests that the youth's self-criticism is working in a similar way, but by focusing on flaws.
Yeah.
They're creating a reason to avoid connection. And as a result, avoiding the risk of being disliked.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder, what are the downsides of this kind of thinking?
Yeah.
It feels like there has to be a cost to all this self-protection.
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of what the philosopher is trying to get at.
Okay.
By avoiding connection. We also avoid all the potential joys and rewards of relationships.
So even though it feels safer in the moment, it's ultimately holding us back from living a fuller life.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of encouragement comes in.
Encouragement.
It's about finding a way to be more accepting of ourselves, flaws and all.
Right.
And then having the courage to connect with others, despite the risks involved.
Okay.
But before we jump ahead,
Yeah.
I want to hear more about this youth and what they were struggling with. Like, what kind of shortcomings were they so fixated on?
Yeah, let's get into the specifics.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of us can probably relate to those feelings of inadequacy.
Well, the youth lists a bunch of perceived flaws, mostly focusing on personality traits.
Okay.
They say things like they lack self-confidence, that they're too pessimistic, always worrying about what others think.
Oh, wow.
They even criticize their physical appearance, like a textbook case of negative self-talk.
That's rough. It sounds like they're being incredibly hard on themselves. What does the philosopher say to all that negativity?
The philosopher's response is brilliant.
Okay.
They ask, when you go on and on about your shortcomings like this, how does it make you feel?
Right.
And naturally, the youth says it puts them in a bad mood.
Makes sense.
They even go so far as to say that no one would want to get involved with someone as warped as them.
So they're basically confirming what the philosopher suspected, that this self-criticism is leading to isolation and loneliness. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. And it's here that the philosopher brings it back to the student with the fear of blushing.
Okay.
They are both using their perceived flaws as a reason to avoid connecting with others.
Right.
They're so afraid of rejection that they isolate themselves to avoid getting hurt.
It's like they're building walls around themselves, brick by painful brick. But it sounds like the philosopher thinks there's a way to break down those walls.
Yeah.
This idea of encouragement seems like a key part of that. Before we get into that, though, can we go back to the blushing analogy?
Sure.
Did the philosopher offer any concrete advice on how to overcome that fear?
That's an interesting question. You see, the philosopher actually refused to cure the student's fear of blushing.
Really? That seems kind of counterintuitive. If the blushing was causing her so much distress, why wouldn't the philosopher try to help her overcome it?
Well, the philosopher argued that the blushing served a purpose. Remember, it was a way for the student to maintain a sense of control and avoid the potential pain of rejection.
So by trying to cure her blushing, they might have been taking away her coping mechanism, her way of dealing with those difficult emotions.
Exactly. The philosopher even suggested that if the blushing were cured and she still faced rejection, the student might come back asking for the blushing back. It's a fascinating insight into how we sometimes cling to our perceived flaws as a way of protecting ourselves.
It's like we'd rather blame our shortcomings than face the possibility that we might just not be compatible with someone.
Yeah.
But how do we actually shift this mindset? How do we move from self-dislike to self-acceptance and courage? That's where this idea of encouragement comes in, right?
Yes, encouragement seems to be the key here.
Okay.
I'm curious about this idea. It sounds promising, but also a bit vague.
Right.
Where does this concept come from? Is it from a specific school of thought?
Right. It feels like a really big idea to unpack, and it would be helpful to know if it's rooted in a particular philosophy or therapeutic approach.
The excerpts don't explicitly mention a specific school of thought, but they do offer clues about what encouragement entails. It seems to involve cultivating self-acceptance, acknowledging our flaws, without letting them define us, and finding the courage to move forward despite the possibility of setbacks.
So it's not just about positive thinking or ignoring our problems. It's about facing them head-on with self-compassion and a willingness to grow.
Yes, and recognizing that those flaws are part of what makes us unique. It's about embracing the perfectly imperfect version of ourselves.
That makes me think of the wabi-sabi philosophy, the Japanese art of finding beauty in imperfection.
That's a great connection. There's a definite parallel there, and it highlights the idea that our imperfections don't diminish our worth. In fact, they can be sources of strength and resilience.
Okay, but it still feels like it takes a lot of courage to step outside that comfort zone of self-dislike. How do we find that courage? Is it something we're born with, or is it something we can develop?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The excerpts don't offer a definitive answer, but they do suggest that encouragement plays a crucial role. It's about fostering a belief in ourselves and our ability to navigate life's challenges.
So it's not just about psyching ourselves up with positive affirmations. There's a deeper process involved.
The philosopher seems to suggest that true encouragement involves a fundamental shift in perspective, a willingness to embrace our imperfections and step into the unknown despite our fears. It reminds me of the work of Brené Brown and her research on vulnerability. She talks about how vulnerability isn't weakness, but actually the birthplace of courage, creativity, and connection.
That's so true. I'm a big fan of Brené Brown's work as well. It's powerful stuff, and it makes me wonder if this encouragement the philosopher is talking about is really about building a foundation of self-acceptance that allows us to handle the inevitable ups and downs of life. I mean, rejection and disappointment are a part of the human experience. It's how we deal with those setbacks that really matters.
I think you're right on the mark, and this brings us back to the conversation between the youth and the philosopher. Remember how the youth was terrified of being disliked or rejected? It was this fear that fueled their self-criticism and their avoidance of connection.
Right, it's like that classic fear of failure turning into a fear of even trying it can be paralyzing.
Exactly. But the philosopher challenges this fear head-on. They remind the youth that it's impossible to go through life without experiencing some degree of hurt or rejection. It's part of being human.
So it's not about becoming immune to these negative experiences. It's about developing the inner strength to handle them in a healthy way.
That's it. It's about building resilience. It's like learning to ride a bike. You're going to fall a few times, but that doesn't mean you give up on riding altogether. You pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and try again.
That's a great analogy. And with each attempt, you get a little better, a little more confident. The same could be said for building relationships and navigating social situations right.
Yeah.
The more we put ourselves out there, the more resilient we become.
Precisely. So it's not about avoiding hurt or rejection altogether. It's about developing the self-awareness and inner strength to handle those experiences without letting them define us or derail our journey.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how this all ties together. But there's still this big question looming. How do we actually cultivate this resilience? What are the practical steps we can take to move from self-dislike to self-acceptance and courage? It feels like this is where the rubber meets the road.
I agree, and that's what we'll dive into next. We'll explore concrete strategies for putting this encouragement into practice.
That's good. What are some of the ways you've dealt with self-doubt or negative self-talk? What helps you build resilience and courage? Share your thoughts with us on social media, and we'll be right back to explore the practical side of encouragement. Welcome back to The Deep Dive.
We've been having a fascinating conversation about this idea of self-dislike as a defense mechanism.
Right.
And this whole concept of encouragement as a way to overcome it.
Yeah, and before we left off, we were talking about the need for practical strategies.
Right, because it's one thing to understand the theory.
Yeah.
But how do we actually apply this encouragement in our everyday lives?
Exactly. It's all well and good to talk about self-acceptance and resilience. But how do we make those things a reality? Especially like when we're constantly bombarded with messages telling us we need to be perfect and successful. It can feel like a real uphill battle.
It absolutely can. We live in a culture that often equates worthiness with achievement. So genuine self-acceptance can feel almost radical.
Yeah.
But
the excerpts we've been discussing offer some really useful insights.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some tangible steps we can take?
Well, the first step, as we've touched on, is awareness.
Awareness.
Start paying attention to those moments of self-criticism.
Okay.
Notice the language you use when you talk to yourself. Is it kind, compassionate, or is it harsh and judgmental?
It's like turning that mindfulness practice inward. Instead of judging our thoughts, we're just observing them with curiosity.
Exactly. And once we're aware of those negative thought patterns,
we can start to challenge them.
Okay.
Ask yourself, is this thought really true? Is it helpful? Or is it just keeping me stuck in a cycle of self-doubt?
I love that. It's like we're putting those negative thoughts on trial.
Right.
Yeah.
And remember, the goal isn't to eliminate all negative thoughts. That's not realistic.
Right.
It's about learning to recognize them for what they are, just thoughts, and choosing not to let them run the show.
That makes me think of cognitive behavioral therapy. The idea that we can reframe our thoughts. Is that what the philosopher is getting at with encouragement?
I think there's a definite connection there. It's about creating that space between our thoughts and our sense of self.
So it's not letting those negative thoughts define who we are. We can acknowledge them without letting them take over.
Precisely. And as we create that space, we can start to cultivate more self-compassion. Treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding you'd offer a close friend.
That's such a powerful reminder. We're often so much harder on ourselves than we would ever be on someone we care about.
Right. And that brings us to another crucial piece of this whole encouragement puzzle. Taking action.
Taking action.
It's not enough to just think positive thoughts.
Right.
We also need to step towards the things that matter to us, even if they feel scary or risky.
So it's about putting ourselves out there despite the fear of rejection or failure.
Yeah.
Okay.
The excerpts really emphasize that it doesn't have to be this huge dramatic gesture.
Right.
It can be as simple as starting a conversation with someone new, sharing your opinion in a meeting, or reaching out to someone you've been wanting to connect with.
It's those small, consistent actions that build our courage muscle.
Right.
Like anything else, it takes practice.
Absolutely. And remember, the goal isn't to become some fearless social butterfly.
Right.
It's about finding your own rhythm, your own way of engaging with the world that feels genuine to you.
It's about showing up authentically, imperfections and all, and trusting that we're worthy of connection regardless of the outcome.
Beautifully put. I think that's the essence of encouragement. It's about cultivating that deep sense of self-acceptance that allows us to move through the world with courage, compassion, and openness to connection.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
If I could leave everyone with one thought, it's this. You are worthy of love and belonging exactly as you are. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to achieve some arbitrary level of success. You simply need to be you. And in that authenticity, in that willingness to embrace your whole self, lies the key to a more connected and fulfilling life.
Those are powerful words to end on, and a lot to think about. We've only scratched the surface of this topic today, but I hope this deep dive has sparked some curiosity and maybe even a bit of that encouragement. Remember, the journey to self-acceptance is a practice, not a destination. Be kind